Hi, I think this is part 5 of the credentials fallacy. Fair use, educational purposes. And I keep saying, it only applies to the person. I'm not a person, I'm a man, an individual. How to avoid using the credentials fallacy yourself. The main way to avoid using the credentials fallacy yourself is to focus on your opponent's arguments as much as possible rather than on their credentials. However, there are, of course, situations where addressing your opponent's lack of credentials can be appropriate. In such cases, it can be reasonable to mention this issue, as long as you properly explain why credentials are necessary in this case, why your opponent lacks those credentials, and how the lack of credentials affects the point that your opponent is trying to make. Furthermore, if you do choose to address your opponent's credentials, then you should generally try to ask your opponent what they think about the credential problem in this case, instead of immediately presenting their supposed lack of credentials as a personal attack. Doing this has two main advantages. First, it demonstrates your willingness to abide by the principles of charity by giving your opponent the benefit of the doubt during the discussion. Second, this frames your question of their credentials as a reasonable part of the discussion rather than as an inappropriate ad hominem attack. Overall, you can avoid using the credentials fallacy by ensuring that you only address your opponent's lack of credentials in situations where those credentials are directly relevant to the discussion. Furthermore, when bringing up your opponent's credentials, you should make sure to explain why their lack of credentials is relevant and then ask them for their opinion on the issue, while also making sure to address the main point that they are trying to make. Summary and conclusions. The credentials fallacy is a logical fallacy which occurs when someone dismisses an argument simply because the individual who made that argument doesn't have formal credentials in the field being discussed, or doesn't have credentials that are viewed as sufficient. This sort of reasoning is fallacious, because it's wrong to assume that someone is necessarily wrong just because they lack sufficient credentials. The credentials fallacy is therefore a type of a genetic fallacy, since it focuses on the source of the argument instead of the argument itself. To counter people who use this kind of reasoning, you can explain why it's fallacious, redirect the discussion back to the original argument, demonstrate the issue with blindly relying on credentials, explain why credentials are not necessary in this case, or demonstrate the issue with defining what constitutes valid credentials. To avoid using this fallacy yourself, avoid referring to people's credentials unless you can clearly explain why their lack of credentials is relevant to the discussion. And if you do choose to refer to their credentials, make sure to also address the main point that they are trying to make. There we go, there's that one. I'm going to have a look, see what's next. But that's the credentials fallacy, what it is and how to respond to it. Okay, thank you. Bye.